Many world powers have arisen simply due to the barriers between its heart and those who threaten it. Putting something between us and them makes defense easier and attacks less common. These barriers can be anything: mountains, rivers, deserts, jungles, ocean. Settling on an island is the polite way of telling everyone else around you to f*** off. When it comes to discussing islands and their effects on the growth of civilization, I like to draw two categories. 1. Small, uncontested islands, and 2. Large islands that help to define what a continent looks like. For both cases, I think that people tend to want certain landforms, such as islands and peninsulas, to be under the control of one single power. Though this lessens with the size of the landmass, usually due to ethno-linguistic differences in different sections. That being said, this is why a lot of island powers focus on conquering the entirety of their home island or archipelago before expanding outwards, even if it's burdensome to do so. Doing otherwise would be like leaving unfinished business, which could directly threaten the heart of a blooming empire. Small, uncontested islands are defined by a homogeneous culture and political hegemony. Single city islands are the best example of this, as the culture and leaders of the city would easily be able to dominate anyone in the surrounding area, assuming it's inhabited. One of the best examples of this is Tenochtitlan, which sat in the middle of the brackish Lake Texcoco. The city probably housed around 250,000 Aztec people when the Spanish showed up, and completely covered the island it was on with small farms and public buildings. Though the island was originally tiny. The Aztecs excelled at expanding their island. They would drive stakes into the shallow parts around it, lash them together with reeds, and pour rocks and soil into these to create more land. This was genius for farming because the canals left between plots of land would irrigate and supply nutrients to the crops. Tenochtitlan had several causeways branching out of it that were constructed in the same way, though some spaces had bridges over them that could be removed for canoes and to keep invaders at bay. That's one of the biggest reasons to live in a small island city, because an invading force would need to cross the water to get to you, and all defenses could be concentrated to ensure that they don't establish a beachhead. This is exactly why Venice was founded, as the Lombards, who were absolutely wrecking the surrounding area, drove refugees to settle on a marshy island that the invaders could not get to. Although, one disadvantage of island living is that it would be relatively easy to be cut off from any outside resources. The Aztecs relied on 2 aqueducts which ran onto the mainland for their fresh water, which the Spanish broke to further their siege of the city. A lack of resources is absolutely the biggest disadvantage to living like this, though larger islands that are dominated by a single entity will have less trouble with this. Such is the case with the self-governing island of Ithaca in the Mycenaean period of Greece, as it was politically dominated by the city-state but had the resources and undeveloped land to sustain itself. In this category, there are also river islands. Rivers may have somewhat the same effect as the surrounding lake or sea, though on a smaller scale due to the relatively small width of most rivers. The concept goes into more detail here. I'm ashamed of plugging so early on, but I did already cover it, so... To the south, the line between my two categories is somewhat blurred. The Minoan civilization on Crete was split up into different political entities on the island during the Bronze Age, though they all shared the same culture, and it is believed that there was very little warfare among them. The island having more than one power undermined some of the strategic advantages that come with it, but because the culture was rather homogeneous and cooperative, like within the small island cities, this often wasn't a huge issue. Most of the geographical advantages of Crete mirror those of the large island varieties, such as Britain or Japan. Big islands and archipelagos have the same water as a barrier advantage as small city islands, but on a much larger scale. Crossing large ocean straits is much more dangerous and involves more coordination than crossing lakes or rivers. Plus, the weather is much more likely to screw you over in the ocean, as what happened to the Mongols when they tried to invade Japan. Twice. The only advantage for invading a massive island as opposed to a small one is that there's more options in deciding where to land, and can make for a more effective surprise attack. Stable island kingdoms aren't expecting an army to show up without seeing a fleet first, so successfully slipping by would be a grand slam for the invaders. Beyond that, large, self-sufficient islands tend to develop cultures unique to their region, and generally have great potential to expand outwards once it reaches political stability and prosperity. Archipelagos are usually pretty tricky to world build for. There are 2 types to consider in this context: arcs and clusters. A linear island arc is generally going to have a singular line where the islands fall, usually with only one major island making up its width at a time, like Japan. Island clusters will have multiple major islands making up the width and length of the archipelago, like the Philippines or Indonesia. These are certainly not geological definitions, as all three archipelagos mentioned before are technically island arcs, but that's not the point of this video. The difference lies in how different people groups interact with each other. Which people groups end up where is based on specific history of migrations and invasions. In a linear island arc like Japan, people groups tend to be more isolated from each other because their only land contact would be in the direction of the axis of the island arc. Whole ethnic groups would be cut off from each other because of other, larger ones blocking their way, as well as the geographic features that do so naturally. And I know what you're thinking. Wouldn't the ethnic groups just sail around them? Well, yes. But cultural diffusion happens more efficiently and faster through direct occupation and border contact, as opposed to diplomatic and commercial contact. Also remember the whole conquer your home island before expanding outward bit, and you can see how a linear axis of islands would be more isolating of people groups. Populations are more innovative with competition, so while struggle is difficult and can destroy civilizations, the ones that endure it end up the strongest. This makes it so that the isolated ethnic communities on a linear island arc may be conquered by populations with better geography, more people, or better luck. Linear island arcs make it easier for an archipelago to unify under one ethnic group, for better or for worse. Contrast that with what I call an island cluster like Indonesia. Island clusters have more room for ethnicities to spread out. Because they can move among the islands in many directions, populations are more resilient to conquest and suppression. Because of this, people groups will evolve with each other. While discussing this, remember, ethnic groups are different from political powers. Populations tend to not cooperate well with other populations near them unless faced with a common threat or an obvious mutual benefit. The most advantaged ethnic group, whether it be due to geography, politics, or diplomacy, almost always creates the empire, and archipelagos and islands are not exempt from this rule. Ethnic rivalries have been overcome almost exclusively in the modern age with the forming of patriotic nation-states, and even then, most of these nation-states still struggle with them today. You only need to look at an ethnicity map of Indonesia and Japan to see the difference in how the islands have affected the growth of different populations. One interesting case study is the British Isles. As an archipelago, it functions as an island cluster, though on an individual scale, it acts like a linear island arc. Due to the migrations and invasions of the Celts, Romans, Germans, Norse, and French, the archipelago is a very diverse place. In terms of major modern-day ethnicities, the island of Great Britain itself is rather linear, as Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall are all separated from each other by the dominant English ethnicity. The island cluster part comes in with the rest of the islands. Ireland, the Isle of Man, and Northern Ireland all have special, at least semi-unique ethnic groups. Because of all these factors, England has had an, interesting relationship with its neighbors. Eventually it came to have the largest empire in recorded history. By the time they started expanding, the English had subdued or not had to worry about the other ethnic powers of the archipelago, allowing them to look outward. Beyond that, Great Britain's identity was shaped around the fact that it is an island bearing the world's dominant navy for hundreds of years and developing a constitutional monarchy centuries before the nationalist movements of the modern period. The English Channel also served to protect the British from the dominant land powers of Europe, such as Napoleon and the Third Reich. Settling on an island has a lot of advantages and a lot of effects on how the inhabitants, cultures, and societies interact with each other. If you build an island power, keep these in mind and your world will keep realism and consistency. Remember that this is based on history and case studies of the real world, so people with different psychologies or abilities may work differently. But still, realistic world building is the best world building. Oh my god, cheapskate!